Call the Prime Minister, I should like to say a few words about our former colleague Lord Prescott. John was first elected to this House in 1970 and served the people of Hull for 4 decades. He became Deputy Leader of the Labour Party in 1994, in which my father also helped on that campaign, and Deputy Prime Minister at the 1997 election. And I've got to say thanks to John for coming to Chorley to ensuring a new start as a Labour member in Chorley. And I'll just share what John did. On that day, tragically, the press were pushing an old lady over. Her arm was broken, and the first thing John said, I must go to that hospital, and he went to the hospital to see that lady as her cast was being put on. That was the kind of person that John Prescott was. He played a major role in delivering the Kyoto Protocol and was a great champion for regional government, integrated transport and affordable housing. After leaving government, he became an active interparliamentary relations, leading the UK delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He was an effective politician, highly respected colleague and a towering figure in the Labour movement and in this House. He will be deeply missed, and all our thoughts are with Pauline and the family. I now call the Prime Minister on a point of order. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for those words which John's family will have heard. There are many members of this House who serve their constituents faithfully. Some deliver change for the entire country. Very few enter into public consciousness, let alone public affection. But John Prescott achieved all of those things. He was absolutely unique, and people loved him for it. He had the most extraordinary life, from failing his 11 plus, to stewarding Anthony Eden on a cruise ship, to being deputy leader of, as he described it, the greatest party that there is. And the longest-serving deputy prime minister this country has ever had. An extraordinary life, Mr. Speaker. And yet, ordinary people across the nation felt that he was one of them. He told a story of working-class lad made good, who embodied the aspiration of working people across the entire country. People felt recognised in the struggles they have, the snobbery, the small-mindedness that still plagues politics even today. But also they felt that he understood and championed their ambitions, their hopes and their dreams. He was a politician for working people through and through. That was who he always was, a proud son of Wales and also an honorary son of the Humber. He served the city of Hull for 40 years, as you said, Mr. Speaker, and everyone knew that he loved it as fiercely as he fought for it. Everything he did was about making working people's lives better, and that was evident from his whole career. A career where he was often ahead of his time, Mr. Speaker. He led, as you said, on climate change, fighting regional inequality, supporting the minimum wage, working to transform public transport, building council houses, and even completing the Channel Tunnel. In many ways, he set the path that we walk today. Because, make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, he did things his own way and forged his own path. And in doing so, he brought about some of the greatest transformation this country has ever seen. The linchpin of New Labour. Because beneath the pugnacious exterior, John was a skilled negotiator, sometimes with immense and perhaps surprising sensitivity. He had an incredible skill, which was the ability to bring people together from different starting points, whether that was his work on climate negotiations or closer at home in his own party, to stand together in a better place. And that sums up another thing that the public, I think, sensed about John. He was not in it for himself. He was willing to work with people that he didn't agree with, as well as challenge those that he usually did agree with. He had great self-awareness, great humility, and if he disagreed fiercely in private, he would do so. And then he would defend the line often improved because of his intervention, in public to the hilt. He was a team player, and he was proud to play for Team Labour. And, Mr. Speaker, that was never more evident than during the campaign season, when it was time to bring out the battle bus, which has become a tradition that our Deputy Prime Minister proudly continued this year. Because the Prescott Express was a morale boost to any campaign. It may have been arriving in a Tesco car park, but John was always met with a reception like Beatlemania. And no wonder, Mr. Speaker, the public were at the heart of John's politics. And it's clear the public had a particular place in their heart for him too. And that was key to his popularity. And indeed, after the famous incident, it was the public who came out swinging for him. Because that night, as you can imagine, Labour campaigners were anxiously dispatched to the most accurate focus group that there is, the local pub, to hear what people were saying. And reports, Mr. Speaker, were clear. The public had his back, just as he'd always had theirs. And so Tony Blair, my predecessor, said simply then, John is John. And he was, Mr. Speaker. John was John. And he will live on in Labour legend and in the memory, I think, of everybody in this House now and who served when he's been in the House, and in the affection of the nation. We remember today his wife, Pauline, and we send our love and condolences to his family and his loved ones. We stand with the people of Hull, the working people across the country, to say thank you, John, for a lifetime of service, for a genuine character, for a changed nation, and, Mr. Speaker, may he rest in peace. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, may I, on behalf of the Opposition, put on record tributes from this side of the House to the late John Prescott. Lord Prescott will be remembered for many things. As a committed Member of Parliament for his beloved constituency of Kingston upon Hull East, as a formidable campaigner for causes he believed in, and for his public service as Deputy Prime Minister. As I said last week, he was a true patriot and had a unique way of connecting with the electorate. Many of us did not know him personally, but his strength of personality was felt. For those of us who came into politics during the New Labour era, our experience of politics was shaped by Lord Prescott. He was a leading figure in making the Labour Party under Tony Blair electable after enduring 4 consecutive election defeats. In the process of broadening his party's appeal, he was someone who ensured that Labour thought about the needs, values and aspirations of regular people across this country, not just those of a metropolitan elite. He was often underestimated, yet by all accounts, he was an intelligent, amusing and relentlessly hard-working man with great political instincts. While I would doubtless have disagreed with him on many things, I would have loved the opportunity to argue with him about making our country better. So in paying tribute to the late Lord Prescott, I express my heartfelt condolences on my behalf and of my party, and I send sincere condolences to his family, his friends and his colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Culture.
Further to those points of order, Mr. Speaker, I rise today not just to pay tribute to my predecessor as the Member of Parliament for East Hull, but also as a family friend for over 50 years. In doing so, I send my heartfelt condolences to Pauline and the family. Many will remember John as a political giant, and indeed he was. But he was also a gentle giant to many. John always had time to chat to anybody who stopped him. Many members today will speak of the great work John did in both this House and outside of it. But I want to speak today about the John we knew in East Hull, both as our MP and, as he was to many, a very dear friend. East Hull was John's adoptive home, and it became such a strong part of his own identity. Everyone in East Hull has their own story of John, those that he helped, and there were many thousands of them. One of John's biggest legacies in Hull was the 55 million regeneration of Preston Road Estate in the heart of the constituency as part of the New Deal for Communities. And I'm told that John was the person in the Cabinet who spearheaded that particular programme. But, Mr Speaker, I had the great pleasure and honour of knowing John all of my life. As kids, we enjoyed family holidays with the Prescotts. And I still keep a picture of me, JP, and the family hurtling down the log flume on my desk in my office. I keep it, Mr Speaker, for a reason. John's clearly the person who's enjoying that the most. But one year, John decided we were going to go to Loch Ness to find Nessie. We didn't find Nessie, but we had the most amazing time with memories we'll never forget. During the voyage, Captain John thought it'd be fun to throw his watch overboard to test our diving skills. As kids, we didn't realise that John was an expert diver. But as it sank too far, we began to panic a bit. But John, with a big grin on his face, dived overboard, missing for, we thought, more than a few minutes, to put it mildly. But then he came up the other side of the vessel, holding the watch with a massive grin on his face. John's legacy will always be etched in the hearts of those he served and the city that he loved. There'll never be another JP, and no member of this House will ever be able to connect with the voters quite like JP did. He truly was one of a kind. John's spirit and approach to politics will live on in all of us who were inspired by him, inspired by his dedication and commitment to the cause. Rest in peace, comrade.
Yeah. Sir Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was never on John Prescott's Christmas card list, but I did have the interesting task of shadowing him in the early noughties for 3 years, and I felt like I got to know him. My respect for him grew, though I was never sure if this was entirely reciprocated. I would occasionally tour the media studios with him, and on one occasion John was getting his makeup on and clearly hadn't realised I was outside the door, and he said to his aide, "Is that bloody Liberal here again?" We spoke more in later years when I was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, as John always retained a deep and well-informed interest in all things climate, with his significant, globally recognised role in securing the Kyoto Climate Treaty. The government's chief climate negotiator in my time, the brilliant but sadly departed Pete Betts, had also been John's key negotiator at Kyoto. Pete would tell the story of how John's sheer energy and staying power were crucial to the success of those negotiations, and how John would tour the negotiating rooms throughout the night, uttering the great phrase, "I'm walking, I'm talking." Our paths also crossed in the great city of Kingston upon Hull, when we eventually managed to get Siemens to invest in a wind turbine manufacturing facility for offshore wind farms. There was a celebration on the day when the first sod was turned to build the factory, and the reception was held in what is called The Deep, a huge tourist attraction which John had played a crucial role in making happen down by the marina in Hull. The Deep is the UK's home to several species of shark. As we walked around it, being instructed about sharks, we were reliably informed that sharks can be very friendly. And though he'd never admit it in public, John was always very friendly to me. He was a trailblazer and an inspiration, even plunging into the Thames in a wetsuit to make an important point about water pollution. Exactly the sort of savvy, effective campaigning I, for one, admire. John will be missed by very many people, and so on behalf of bloody Liberals everywhere, I send my heartfelt condolences to Pauline, to John's children and grandchildren, and to all of his family and many friends.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr Speaker. And further to that point of order, as Chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party, can I also echo the tribute made by the Prime Minister and send our thoughts and our love to John's family. And at the PLP tonight, we'll have our chance to reflect on the enormous contribution to the country and the party. And as a former Labour organiser, I can tell you he was beloved by our members. They would move mountains in Wales to go and see him. And although he himself said, when I do die, after 50 years in politics, all that they will show on the news is the 60 seconds of me thumping a fella in Wales, I think the many, many tributes over the weekend rightly reflected his immense contribution to the country, which should never ever be underestimated. His drive to improve council housing, his championing of the minimum wage, his leadership on climate change, climate action, before it was a thing. A true socialist and thoroughly authentic. He only cared about making people's lives better. But back to that punch. There are many others here today who were close friends with John, who worked with him and knew him far, far better than me. We were, however, connected by one event. For I, as the youngest General Secretary of the Welsh Labour Party, organised his visit to Rhyl. Clearly not very well, although he never seemed to hold it against me, and he didn't get me sacked, which was an enormous relief at the time. There is so much I could say about that day. He was a trooper. He went back inside immediately after the punch and did this rather strange comedy show at the Little Theatre. But I won't test your patience, Mr Speaker. The definitive guide is there in Matt Ford's podcast with Martin Angus, which I would recommend you all listen to. However, for those of us there in the background in the footage, it just never goes away. And although he was right, that clip has been shown 1 million times again over the weekend. His legacy was always far, far bigger than a GIF. He will be much missed by our big Labour family.
Father House, Edward Leigh.
I served for many years in this place with John Prescott, and of course I admired him from afar as a true Labour man, a man of true grit. I'm not sure that my admiration of him was reciprocated, but we did hold him in great affection. My first memory of him was when I arrived in this place as a new Member of Parliament in 1983, and I gave a speech, and John was sitting down here, and I could see him grunting, obviously furious. He probably thought I was just an absurd young Thatcherite opinionated brat, and he was probably right. And talking of Mrs Thatcher, my next memory of him was I went down to the little members' canteen, which we used to have downstairs, the members' canteen, and John was there having a quiet supper. And Mrs Thatcher came in. And I always remember this, that the moment my boss, Mrs Thatcher, came in, I could see John waving his hands with fury at her of all that she had done. And Neil Kinnock leant over and said, "Calm down, John, calm down, John." I just thought that here's a man of, real strong opinion, and we have so many anemic politicians around today. How wonderful it was. I'm not, of course, looking at anybody, of course. How wonderful it was to have a man like John Prescott on the other side of the chamber. Of course, he much mellowed, and it was a great joy to serve with him on the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And he did mellow, and I remember him saying that his children wanted to go on Celebrity Come Dancing, but he decided not to. But that would have been something for the history books, John Prescott on Celebrity Come Dancing. So, really, I just want to end by saying that as a local Member of Parliament, I want to pay tribute to him. And I do take my children, or I did take my children to the deep, and all those things he did for Hull. And I wish some of you could have watched Hull North, which is our sort of small local television programme last week, to see the tributes and what people were saying, local people, about how much he was so much loved in Hull and worked so hard for the people. A great man, and he will be sorely missed.
Steve Yemm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was also deeply saddened to hear of the death of John Prescott, and my condolences also to Pauline and his sons and all who were close to him. I considered him to be a good friend of mine and to Mansfield. He was a giant of a man and a champion of the coalfields, devolution, local government and, of course, climate action. I first met John in the 1980s as an activist in the Labour Party and enjoyed supporting him both for his first campaign to be deputy leader in 1988 and again for leader and deputy leader in 1994. His legacy includes setting up the Coalfield Regeneration Trust, which was established to help support former coalfield areas and communities like Mansfield impacted by the pit closure programmes of the 1980s and 90s. This helped ensure that my area received millions of pounds of funding. John has a particularly strong link to my constituency of Mansfield, and particularly with my Labour predecessor, Sir Alan Meal, who was his parliamentary private secretary for some years. And anecdotally, I can recall many endearing memories of John, including a time when we were both playing table tennis in Sir Alan's front yard in Mansfield. A lovely sunny day, and we were enjoying our game in the garden on a day when the Prime Minister was out of the country on business. And an important call came through, which he had to take, and we paused our game. To this day, I have no idea who it was or what was said, but the conversation clearly distracted John, so much so that when he arrived back, he hit the ball with such force that it bounced right off the table and hit the ministerial car. And Mr. Speaker, from that experience, I can assure the House that the left hook still packed a mighty punch. In the years after John had left office, and after many visits to Mansfield, I would often drive him back to Newark or Doncaster station so he could get the train to London or back home to Hull. And Mr. Speaker, the insights from this frank and honest recollections of history from the Blair and Brown years will stay with me for a very long time. May you rest in peace.
Yes. Sir David Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I first arrived in the House, it was common amongst the Conservative Party, the Thatcherite Conservative Party, I say to my pallid friend, to view John Prescott as public enemy number one. And it was an act he loved playing into, in public at least. But that being said, he was, certainly to me, when he's outside the studio and outside the chamber, friendly, helpful, indeed almost the best possible constituency neighbour you could want. But he was also quintessentially a working class hero, something I suspect the current Deputy Prime Minister adopts as well. And of course he was a brilliant and good constituency ally and a forceful defender of the interests of the people of Hull, with the emphasis on force. However, he was also a necessary champion of the new Labour Party. The Prime Minister referred to the fact that, implicitly, that he delivered one man, one vote. And I think we should remember that that was an act of huge courage for him to take on his own union allies, I think at about 1 hour's notice, and persuade them to support the new neophyte Tony Blair. And frankly, despite the snobbery of the London establishment about his education and so on, it was a very, very unwise person who underestimated the intellect of John Prescott. He was a formidable innovator, you know, on looking at the Environment Secretary, on environment, on Europe, on devolution, on a whole range of things. He was a brilliant innovator. He was what we had all hoped to be, not a creature of history, but a changer of history. And for that, we should always admire him. And as well, to put to one side all of those grand things, he also was greatly, greatly loved by his family. And on that basis, I offer my condolences to Pauline and the rest of the family.
Yeah. Andy McDonald.
Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to add my own few words to the tributes made, and especially welcome the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull. They were so clearly warm and personal. I just simply wanted to add that John Prescott's many achievements have already been told in terms of his commitments to climate change and other matters. A truly authentic working class hero, somebody who would always attract a crowd wherever he went when he's on his famous battle bus, and he persevered with that through good times and in poorer times. But I think what sometimes may be missed is his commitment to devolution and the great efforts he made, certainly in the northeast of England, committing to the campaign for a northeastern assembly. We were not successful on that occasion. The referendum was not won, but ultimately John's legacy prevails by the institutions, the devolved authorities that we've seen ever since. And on a personal note, Mr. Speaker, I just also want to put on the record my thanks to him for his personal support to me. I found myself propelled onto the shadow front bench a little bit prematurely and unexpectedly, but he was of great support to me in discharging the transport brief, and such immense knowledge that he retained, and at every single occasion he would offer that encouragement, for which I'll be eternally grateful. He was a true giant of the Labour movement. We will miss him enormously, but his legacy remains on, and I too would like to pass my sincere condolences to Pauline and to all of his family. Thank you.
Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Scottish National Party, could we pass on our most sincerest condolences to Pauline, John's family, and to his many friends, colleagues and comrades right across the Labour movement. You have lost a colossus of a man and an inspiration to working class people right across the United Kingdom who were inspired to come into politics because of the example that John Prescott showed. I remember coming down here as a new MP in 2001, Mr. Speaker, and you would observe the Labour front bench titans, all of them, all known to the UK public, but predominant amongst all of them was John Prescott, and it was John Prescott the public wanted to hear from. When he appeared on the TV screens, that was when the public paid attention and listened to what he had to say. And there was this curious affection and resonance that he had with the British public that means something that, if we could bottle it, I'm sure we'd all take a little bit of that and a sup of that today. And I'll never forget, as a candidate in 2001, and who could, I think we all knew where we were in 2001 as a candidate when that famous incident came in that the member for Newport East has referenced. I was with a bunch of sixth formers at Brecon High School at a hustings, and I remember one of the senior people saying to me, if it's like that every day in your political life, I want a bit of that. So there's inspiration for you, Mr. Speaker. He was a huge music fan too, and I remember he was a great supporter of our music act in MP4. We could never quite master the jazz that he seemed to favour, though maybe as tribute to him we'll maybe get round to doing one of these numbers, but it was something that he completely loved. And everybody's talked about his commitment to climate change, but it was also his commitment to devolution. A few colleagues have mentioned that. And I think it was John Prescott that was the engine that drove that path towards a Scottish Parliament and, of course, the regional assemblies, which will be happening as a matter of course with this new Labour government. He was a part of a generation, Mr. Speaker, that we are now sadly beginning to lose. But he will stand out as one of the true great parliamentarians in this House of the past few decades, and we will all miss him dearly.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's so wonderful to hear all of the various tributes to John, and I just wanted to share my own memories of him. As some people have already mentioned, when it comes to campaigning, his big thing was his battle bus. And who wouldn't love touring the country, eating sweets with Martin Angus? And I'm sure the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyne will attest to that. I have my own memory of John's battle bus, which is after the 2005 election. He got a small group of us together and we toured London as commuters were on their way to work at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, with John on the tannoy, thanking them all individually for voting Labour and for another 5 years of a Labour government, watching people literally stop in the street, confused by why a bus was talking to them, only to discover that it was actually the Deputy Prime Minister that was talking to them, was incredible. He then took us all to his flat, where, having had no sleep at all, he made us bacon sandwiches and tea. This was John at his best, generous, indomitable, and completely unpredictable. His incredible achievements and those of that Labour government will stand the test of time. He was the cement that kept that broad church of those new Labour governments together. And we will always remember him for that. And I just want to say, last year my father died of Alzheimer's. And it's very difficult in those early days to actually remember the man who was before that cruel disease took them away. I really do hope that Pauline and his family are listening to the wonderful tributes that are being paid here in this house and around the country, and so that they can remember the extraordinary man and the extraordinary life that John was and lived. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Bernard.
Speaker, further to the point of order, I first collided, if that's the right word, with John Prescott when I was Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, as he ploughed on with his integrated transport plan, which was one of the centrepieces of the first Blair administration. I found that some of my colleagues very easily tried to treat John Prescott as a bit of a joke. That was a mistake. Yes, we teased him about his 2 Jags, and he rather loved that. But he was utterly sincere in what he did, and passionate and pretty brutal with his opposition opponents when he felt he was on top. We clashed again over the proposals for regional assemblies, and great campaigner that he was, he lost the North East referendum, and I don't think he ever really forgave me for that. But when required, he could be a great statesman. He was right to insist on a public inquiry into the Marchioness disaster, which the previous government had refused to hold. And he was right immediately to announce an inquiry into the Paddington rail disaster as soon as it had happened. And I recall getting the most surprising telephone call, one of the most surprising telephone calls of my political life. Having told the conference, the Conservative conference, he was right to call that public inquiry and we should wait for its outcome, I got a call from him to thank me for that bit of bipartisanship, which even he was capable of when the cameras weren't looking. And I do pay tribute to him for this, because the Cullen inquiry came up with a completely new safety regime for rail, including a rail accident investigation branch for the Department of Transport. We've never had a public inquiry into a rail accident ever since, because of the safety regime that he implemented following the inquiry. And every survivor of the Paddington rail crash and subsequent rail crashes is grateful to him for what he did for passenger safety on our railways, and we should remember him, if for nothing else, for that. And I send my best wishes to his family and to all his friends and colleagues on the other side of the House at this sad time.
Yeah. Julie Mims.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have 2 particular memories of Lord Prescott that I would like to share. The first is from my time working for the disability charity Scope. We had decided as a campaigns team to use the 1997 general election to highlight the many obstacles that disabled people face when exercising their democratic right to vote. I and my campaign colleagues devised the Polls Apart campaign, which included a special campaign pack for candidates. Now, bearing in mind this is in the halcyon days before email, a campaign pack was something of a rarity. And so we printed, stapled and posted out hundreds of packs to candidates the length and breadth of the UK, including one to the Labour candidate for Kingston upon Hull. Off it went, second class, and to our amazement, a week or so later, a reply came back, saying not only did Mr Prescott support the campaign, but that he had written to all of Labour's candidates in his capacity as the General Election Coordinator, instructing them to take the campaign actions our pack suggested. And then more than that, when Labour was elected a few weeks later, he brought forward an amended Representation of the People's Act to make it easier for disabled people to exercise their right to vote. I had met John Prescott a few years earlier when I worked for the then Member of Parliament for Streatham, the Right Honourable Keith Hill. Both John and Keith were members of the RMT parliamentary group, a group that was as broad and diverse as its talent was deep. I asked Keith ahead of my remarks today if he had any particular memories of John that I might share with the House, and he told me of one from his time as Minister in the Office for the Deputy Prime Minister. John and Keith were due to make a presentation on Labour's housing growth areas to the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in the Cabinet Room one morning at 9 a.m. At 4 a.m, John was still working on the presentation and decided that he needed to know about the rail connections between Cambridge and Oxford. So he phoned Network Rail. Members can doubtless imagine the startled reaction of the poor Network Rail official who answered that call at 4 o'clock in the morning from someone claiming to be the Deputy Prime Minister and who had a very specific question about east-west rail links. Tony Blair was equally amazed at 9 a.m. that morning. "And did he tell you what the rail connections are?" asked the PM. "There aren't any," replied John. "We're going to change that." And now, thanks to the budget, that change will finally be delivered. A fitting tribute, perhaps, to the work ethic, energy and enthusiasm for change that John Prescott exemplified.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to Pauline and all of John's family at what must be a truly devastating time for them. David sent me a message just after John had died, and David used to work in my office, and he was very close to his father, who saw him as his hero and his friend, and I think we send our condolences to all of them. I obviously knew John in the House for many years, and when he was first elected, along with Dennis Skinner, they shared a flat in Clapham. I don't know what went on in that flat in Clapham, but whilst they were good friends, they were also very different characters. And I later learnt that after the last vote ever took place in the House, Dennis and John would both leave to go back to the flat, but never travel together, because Dennis always made sure he got there first, so he could get hold of the one television in the flat and turn on and watch the darts or the snooker, whatever else. John would turn up and want to watch Newsnight. Dennis refused to change the channel. Said, "No way, you watch the darts with me." And you could sort of imagine the repartee and the arguments that were going on between them, which would have been incredibly funny. In the 2017 election, John offered to help in any way he could, and he was fantastic, and we had several events we did together. One day we started in Hull in the morning with a launch of our Arts Manifesto, and then went on a tour all around Yorkshire and Humberside in the famous bus. John seemed to know the owner of every fish and chip shop in the whole of Yorkshire and insisted on stopping at every fish and chip shop in Yorkshire, so we had a big supply of fish and chips all day long. And then we got to Scarborough, where we were doing a rally there in the pavilion by the seafront, and John and I got up to speak on the stage, and a lot of the people there, I don't think they really realised it was a political rally going on. They thought they were just there enjoying the sunshine. Then these two guys get up on the stage and start talking. Then they loved John because he brought out Freddie the Fox, and we had a long discussion about the evils of fox hunting, the evils of Tory fox hunting, the Tories who were always going to bring back fox hunting, the Tories who would kill the fox. Then he pulled Freddie out of his coat and said, "Look at poor Freddie here. They're going to tear him apart. That's what the Tories do to you." And he was loved for all of that. I want to say thank you to John for what he did, but also just remember one of the crucial points in his political career was the issues of climate change and Kyoto. It wasn't easy, it wasn't popular, it wasn't normal. A lot of people refused to even consider the issues of what we are doing to the natural world and the environment, and how there are limits to what you can do, and hence the protocol that he negotiated and signed up. And I think he was one of the very important people to start to change the global debate about climate change and respect for the natural world and the environment, and I think we should all say thank you to John Prescott for that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first time I met John Prescott in his role as Deputy Prime Minister was in 1997, when he opened up Admiralty Arch to 60 young homeless people for part of the winter shelter programme at the time, and it was a bitterly cold winter. And at the time, a Conservative backbencher, Crispin Blunt, said that this project would be treating an historic building as if it were a flagship for undesirables. Well, given that John was frequently described as undesirable by many of his opponents in his life, he took that as a badge of honour. And he was really, really proud of that homelessness project. I'll never forget the way he shared breakfast with those rough sleepers and took a real interest in every one of their lives. It was a testimony to his compassion, his practical politics, and also to his unwavering commitment to housing policy. Many, many millions of council tenants had home improvements with new windows, new doors and home insulation, and none of them will ever forget that. They're all the basics that many of us take for granted, but which far too many people lacked at the time. In a superb biography by my former late colleague on The Independent, Colin Brown, naturally titled Fighting Talk, there was a lovely quote and a telling quote from John, and it was this: "There are those priests on the left who want to keep their consciences, and there are those who will get their hands dirty. I belong to the Dirty Hands Brigade." So John was regularly patronised, he was frequently underestimated, but he had the last laugh with delivery for real working people. For that, we'll all be grateful.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you. In the last 6 months of 2005, the United Kingdom took over the rotating presidency of the European Union. And Prime Minister Blair wanted to make a big success of it. One of their concerns is that there was a young British MEP who was prone to behaving very badly in the chamber and being particularly rude to visiting heads of state. And so John Prescott was sent to see me. He himself, of course, had served as an MEP and was a big project supporter, loved everything about the European Union. So he came to explain to me that it would be very bad for Britain if I was to stand up and cause a scene when Prime Minister Blair was speaking. I won't say that he threatened me, but I certainly felt deeply intimidated and behaved myself impeccably over the course of the next 6 months. That was perhaps the bruiser, John Prescott, but then a couple of years later, it was Remembrance Sunday, and the ceremony was over, the parades had finished, and I was walking up Whitehall, and then, to my astonishment, walking on his own, without any security, was the Deputy Prime Minister. And I said hello, and I wondered what he was doing, and he'd seen a group on the other side of Whitehall of Arctic convoy veterans. And, of course, John, a seafarer himself, went over, spoke to the men who'd endured such appalling hardship in the last couple of years of the war, and said to them, "I'm going to fight and make sure that you guys get a campaign medal after all these years, recognising what you've done." Well, they did get the medal, and I got the message, and I understood why he'd been so phenomenally successful from humble roots. He just connected, he got on with people, he was very, very human. So we mourn his passing, but perhaps also we mourn the passing of big working-class characters in politics. We need far more of them.
Bill Esterson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. John had many connections with the northwest of England, as you well know. He went to school on the Wirral. He was a parliamentary candidate in Southport and returned there to campaign in that 2017 general election. And of course, he was a seafarer out of Liverpool, and he was presented with a trophy by Anthony Eden, who the Prime Minister mentioned earlier. The trophy was for winning a boxing bout on board the ship, and it was there that he honed his craft that maybe led to what we know him for so famously later on. And when I came in here in 2010, I bumped into him in the committee corridor. He was sitting at a desk working, and he said he was there because despite being the former Deputy Prime Minister, he was having to share an office with 4 other members of the House of Lords. He'd recently been ennobled, and moaned about the fact there was no preferential treatment for him. But in spite of the moan, he was getting on with the job, as John always did. But my favourite story of him is in that 2010 election campaign. The battle bus turned up on Grand National Day outside Aintree Racecourse, and he had a campaign to keep the Grand National free to air on terrestrial TV. And there he was with his speakers, his loudspeakers, haranguing the racegoers to come and sign his petition, which they did in their droves. And not only did they sign the petition, they then queued in large numbers for selfies with John, because it goes to this point about the affection in which he was held. And it will stay with me forever just what an impression John had that day. And when I came in here and was serving in this place as he was serving in the Lords, he was a source of terrific advice to me, and I'm proud to have counted John as a friend over the years. I wish my best to Pauline, to David and to the rest of his family. May John rest in peace.
Redstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the point of order, when I was elected to Beverley and Holderness in 2005, John Prescott was, of course, already a legend and the MP for neighbouring East Hull. And he was, of course, the word-mangling, fast-fisted former bar steward who had, for the last 8 years, been Deputy Prime Minister of this United Kingdom. And hearing the tributes from across the House today, hearing all the ways that that one man was able to influence history and make a difference is an inspiration, I think, hopefully to working-class aspirant politicians all over the country, but also to people in this House as well. But I knew him a few years before I entered Parliament, because he came to Cambridge for a transport summit. So I organised a demonstration against this happening and stood there outside all day. And more, of course, as the day went on, he didn't come out. So eventually, when he did come out, I was just about the only demonstrator left. So I immediately berated him and his entourage, and we then had a surreal dance around the car park before he went straight up to this Jaguar and tried to get in. It wasn't his. I think it took quite some time for him to forgive me for that. I would see John regularly, as do colleagues from Hull, such as the member for Hull North, who's sitting on the front bench opposite, on Hull trains, normally surrounded by papers and at a four-place table, trying to keep it entirely to himself. Though he was gruff, he was also engaging, and he would often come to Beverley. So Pauline would go shopping in the shops of Beverley, and he would come to the Royal Standard, which is the finest pub and establishment in Beverley, and where he was always very welcome, and where members to this day hold him in the highest regard. As has been remarked, he led our delegation to the COP at Kyoto in 1997, and was widely regarded as being the key element in delivering that historic outcome, the first time that an international agreement was made to recognise and cut climate emissions. Former US Vice President Al Gore said that he had, and I quote, never worked with anyone in politics quite like John Prescott. And John continued to take climate issues seriously, and we would have passionate and rather loud conversations on the train as we went to and fro from East Yorkshire. And when I led our delegation to the last year's COP, which was the first to commit to phasing out fossil fuels, I knew that my team and I were following in the footsteps of someone who may have come from a humble background, but went on to change the world.
Becky Gittins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just over 2 months ago, I rose in this chamber for the first time to give my maiden speech. I opened with a comical line about one of my constituency's most famous sons, Lord John Prescott. Though I'm sad to be rising today to commemorate his passing, it's important to reflect the indelible mark that he has left on British politics. A formidable character, John Prescott was a political giant, but never stopped being one of us, an ordinary, down-to-earth, working-class man, whose ambition for communities like his as part of a trailblazing Labour government ambitions like his and others are the reason why so many of us are here today. Often underestimated by both his political allies and enemies, he was the glue that held the Labour government together and saw it deliver so much of what it did. Though personally I knew him little more than as an overly keen teenager at Labour Party conference, asking for a selfie with a political hero, he did oblige, though in his customary unimpressed fashion. But his impact on myself and so many on these benches has been huge. So I rise today, on behalf of the people of Clwyd East, to say a fond farewell to one of our own, a treasured son of North Wales, a political trailblazer, and a true one-off. My thoughts are with Pauline and his family.
Kevin McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to add my words to all these warm tributes to John. I got to know him and encountered him outside of a political context. It's a matter of record that towards the end of his time as Deputy Prime Minister, he had several bouts of ill health and was admitted to hospital on a couple of occasions and was admitted to the critical care unit where I was a nurse at the time. He made an incredible impression on me and my fellow staff. He was actually a really great patient, which, let's face it, not every VIP that ever crosses those words into a ward can that be said of. So, and he was warm and fun and abrasive in the right way and challenging in the right way. You know, one of my most abiding memories is being summoned in to see the Deputy Prime Minister because his hospital food was rubbish. So he wanted to complain about that. Hopefully that will be the only time a Deputy Prime Minister calls me in to criticise something that I'm responsible for, but you never know. After it, a real testament is that John invited all of us staff that had looked after him to come and do a big tour in a very John Prescott way of, you know, in Admiralty House, going all the way through the back corridors of Whitehall and throwing out great bits of history and anecdote. And he finished up with a mock auction where he'd acquired a lot of gewgaws and knickknacks from all of his diplomatic visits abroad, and he was throwing them out with his very strong arm to people in the room, and people were catching them, and hopefully many of those people and colleagues that I had at the time still got some of those items and have treasured him after hearing this. So honestly, I really want to give my heartfelt condolences to Pauline and to John's family. Thank you.
I think the House is always at its best, and I'm sure John would have been smiling at the tributes. I've got to say it was fantastic. The only thing I would add is that John managed to divide Hull into two when he became a Robin. But we'll leave it at that. Right, we now come to urgent question. Let the front benches just change over.